welcome to the Hustle and Flow podcast.
A platform we use to explore varying perspectives and opinion through candid conversation.
We chat about philosophy, business, and all things life. I'm Shaun the Hustle.
And I'm Les the Flow.
Let's go. Our guest today is a leadership consultant and communications expert. She is among the top 8% of Canadian speakers within the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers and holds their highest earned designation of Certified Speaking Professional. She also finds herself in the top 1% of the Global Speakers Federation, holding a Global Speaking Fellow designation. Prior to starting her speaking business, she was the CEO of a financial services support company where she accelerated success, executing a 5-year startup plan in just 3 years, distributing dividends a year ahead of schedule, and leading a subsequent highly successful merger. Her practice centers on assisting leaders who want to elevate their message to create flexible, engaged, and agile workplaces, and in the process, maximize their return on influence. She believes that everyone should live a great story to build their legacy. She has held numerous leadership positions in national and international organizations, both professional and philanthropic, and she serves clients in over 50 countries on 6 continents. With that, we would like to welcome today Susan Luke Evans.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Susan. And, Shaun's given us a brief sort of outline as to who you are to our audience. But I'd really love to simply invite you and give you the floor and, invite you to share with everyone, your origin story, your backstory, what makes you Susan Luke Evans of today. So, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie. I appreciate it. And thank you, Shaun. That was a lovely introduction. I guess, my dad was a minister. My mom told stories on the radio before I was born. She was a career woman before it was fashionable. And so they say in the family that when I was born talking and telling stories, and I've never stopped. So whether that's exactly true or not, stories have become my passion over the years. And I started my professional career as a school teacher in remote indigenous villages in Alaska. No TV, no telephone, no internet, no running water most of the time, where it was awfully cold and awfully dark for awfully long. And from there, after a few years of being very cold, I moved as a single parent with my young son to Honolulu because we deserved it. And I taught in a private school briefly in Honolulu, as well as served as their director of admissions, but I finally was able to graduate. And I guess I had a flat tire in the right place at the right time kind of a thing, because when you teach school for a while and then you decide you want to be in the wonderful world of business, it's hard to write a resume because what do you say? I was fortunate enough to go to work for a statewide trade association in Honolulu for credit unions. So I worked with them for just a little while, and then one of my projects was to learn about automated teller machine service and for credit unions in the state. And we didn't know anything, and I was kind of dumb and stupid about the whole thing and thought that you put your card in that machine, and if the little man that was in the machine liked you, he gave you your money and your card back. And if he didn't, then you didn't get your money or your card. Now, it wasn't really that simple, but that was kind of the level of my education in terms of that sort of thing. So anyway, they hired me to be the CEO of this startup company. And, we kind of stumbled around together for a bit. I reported to a board of directors, and my job was to go out and get shareholders to join in the organization. And the shareholders were credit unions in the state. So that's what I did. And as you said in your introduction, we had a pretty successful first 3 years. And I thought, well, I think now I can start my own business. And so after the merger, that's what I did. and never really looked back. I've reinvented my business several times, but it's always been centered around people skills and communication and leadership. And the nice thing for me was that I had served in a CEO position, and so I could kind of work with C-suite kinds of folks, and they at least had an inkling that I knew a little bit about what they were facing. I didn't ever, I mean, it wasn't a huge organization, but we did have staff and all of that. And so I had that experience on a much smaller scale. So I brought that to the table, and that was coincidental. If anybody had ever told me that I was going to do that, I would have said they were crazy. But we were very fortunate. And so after that, as I said, I started my business. I worked a little bit in Hawaii with various organizations, again in the leadership and communication arena, so to speak. And then I branched out and started working on the mainland. And finally, I decided that, it's a long commute to the mainland to work from Hawaii. And so I moved to the mainland and was fortunate enough to work in as a consultant and a speaker and so forth in the oil and gas industry, which I knew nothing about again, but they didn't need me to know anything about oil and gas. They needed me to help them with their leadership skills and that sort of thing. So that's what started taking me around the world. They were an international company. And so I spent time in the normal places in the US, Houston and Oklahoma City and those kinds of places that are oil kinds of places. And then I went to Scotland, up on the North Sea, to Aberdeen for a week every month for 5 years. So it kind of became like my second home. I also worked in the London area and in Western Australia. I was there for a while, all with the same company, and in Singapore. So there were some, in Ecuador, which was a whole nother conversation, where they gave me their English speaking driver, and they told me that I couldn't go anywhere except with their driver, but not to worry because he spoke English. So the first morning I dusted off my high school Spanish and I got in the car and I said, "Buenos dias, Manuel." And he said, "Buenos dias." And then I said, "Cómo estás?" And he rattled off whatever. And then my Spanish was done, And so I thought, okay, it's your turn. So I said, "So Emmanuel, do you have children?" "Yes." "Boys or girls?" "Yes." "How many?" "Yes." And then I thought, well, I guess your English is done too. So I learned a lot from experiences like that were funny, but they were fun and they were educational, and it helped me to appreciate the different cultures and the different environments in which I was able to work. And then most recently, before COVID, I spent about 10 years, I guess, working on a contract with Marriott International. So that just expanded my my international client base and my opportunities to go to 6 continents and work in over 50 countries and do it more than once, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, and sometimes just once a year. But it was a great run, and I loved it. And I miss the people and I miss the interaction and the cultures, but I don't miss the travel. So international travel got pretty I don't know what the word is, long, I guess is the best way to say that, over the years. And I didn't get any younger doing that. So I was quite happy, and I've been quite happy to just kind of sit at home. I came to Canada because I fell in love with a Canadian, and he wasn't about to move. He was born in Toronto, and while he traveled the world as well, and we sometimes worked together, he was not going to move. So I came here, and then much to our joint dismay, he got sick and passed away a few years ago. And so I elected to stay. And just this past March, I finally got my citizenship. So now I have dual citizenship in both the US and Canada. So that's kind of my journey. In addition to speaking at conferences and conventions and working with in the industries that I mentioned, I've also written a couple of books. The first one was called Log Cabin Logic, and it was mostly about how to be creative and create success where you are with what you have. And so I used a lot of the experiences from when I was in Alaska, and we didn't have certain things dependably, like groceries or those kinds of things. We had lots of snow. And the most recent book is coming out next month, November 17th, and it is called Return on Influence, and the subtitle is The New Currency for Leaders. So I'm very excited about it. It's built around a model of influence, how leaders influence other people, and how they can elevate their message so that their influence is more sustainable rather than temporary. And then there's lots and lots of examples and case studies and stories, both from my own experience as a CEO, as well as many of the different people and different areas that I worked in and people that I worked with. So I'm excited about that. And then I'm not sure what's after that, but I'm sure I'll get into mischiefs one way or another. So that's my story.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. It's such a colorful and, quite the wave, or different waves you've been riding, huh?
Yeah. It's a journey, and I've never been really satisfied to do the same thing. I think if I had been, I could have stayed as the CEO of that company in Hawaii, and we never would have merged, and it would have been, it would have been fine, but it would have been the same thing every day. And that's not what really gets me up in the morning. Well, nothing really gets me up in the morning. I'm not a morning person. I guess I left that part out. But so I'm real glad that it's 6 o'clock where I am in the evening, because if it was 6 o'clock in the morning, you would have a whole different story.
So, Susan, it's like Shaun said, it's been it seems like a very decorated ride that you've taken, and it seems you've achieved quite a lot along the way. And like what I've sort of taken from it is like back to the very first sort of things that you mentioned in terms of your love of storytelling and how they may have colored your writings and your musings into your books. I'd love to start back, in your times teaching the Indigenous, and what that sort of experience sort of gave you in terms of perspective and how you sort of saw things differently.
I was, just like barely 21, and I got there, and the first village that I was in was above the Arctic Circle. It was called Fort Yukon. And the school had all 12 grades, and many of the kids, I was charged with teaching English, traditional English literature and grammar and all that, to kids who did not speak English as their first language. So that was a challenge. We didn't, of course, have internet at that time. We won't go into how old I am, but anyway, we did have a lot of different kinds of equipment, and apparently there was a some sort of a federal funding that if you didn't spend it all one year, then you didn't get it the next year. So they spent it every year, and so if one video thing was good, then 6 were better because they had to spend all the money. So we had lots and lots of that kind of equipment. So I decided in my, idealistic, I'm going to save the world kind of environment, that I needed to do something different for the kids, because to tell them to read the chapter and do the questions and take a test, they couldn't do that. Some of them were older than I was because they had been in and out of school over time to help their families with subsistence hunting or fishing or whatever. So I was, this this little tiny blonde person that was trying to teach to some of these great big guys, and they'd never had a good experience in an English class. And so I put them on a point system, and I allowed them to do all kinds of different things. They could write a story, they could draw a picture, they could do watch a video and report on that. They could read a book. All those different kinds of things, trying to use all the different types of media that we had available. And it worked really, really well. And I mean, it was total luck on my part, because this was my first time out of the box, so to speak. But I just knew that I wanted them to be successful. And so they knew how many points they needed in order to get certain grades at the end of each period. And so I told them, I said, there's no reason why everybody can't get an A or a B, because you know where you'll be. And if you don't have enough points, you can do extra credit. And I said, the only thing you have to do that's traditional is when we have tests, you have to pass the tests. Because if you don't pass the test, then, I can't justify all this other stuff. So they loved it. And we had a good time. And it wasn't all roses, of course. We had some discipline problems. I certainly had some understanding problems with language and that sort of thing. But I taught English to grades 7 through 12 that year. So the funniest story that I mean, it really wasn't funny, it was kind of tragic, but at the end of the first grading period, all my students in every class got either an A or a B. And I was thrilled, and they were just like bouncing off the walls, because they'd never gotten those kinds of grades in English. Well, there was a science teacher that taught down the hall that had been there, I don't know, 15 or 20 years or something. And he came storming into my classroom. And he said, "What do you mean giving all these kids A's and B's?" And I was like, idealistic me. I said, "Oh, I didn't give them, they earned them." And oh, that didn't set well at all. And so he said, "Well, they're not capable." And I said, "Excuse me, what are you talking about?" I said, "You want to see my grade book?" And he said, "No." He said, "Haven't you looked at their IQ scores?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Well, if you had looked at their IQ scores, you would know that they can't get A's or B's." And I thought about it for a minute, and then in my very brave voice, I said, those IQ tests were designed in Middle America for Middle Americans. And I said, this is not Middle America. And I said, and if you recall, in those tests, they have pictures. And there's, like, for example, there's a picture of a tire, and you're supposed to match it with a car or a train or a boat. And in Middle America, they match tires with cars, but we didn't have any cars. So they matched it with a boat, because it was a fishing village on a river, and they put tires on the outside of the boat for when they came up against the dock. And I said, but they sent those tests back to Middle America to get graded. So of course they were all wrong. I said, that's not fair. I said, the only thing these kids don't have is a wider experience base. And I said, that's not their fault. Well, he went out mumbling and so forth and so on. But I continued, and he just kind of growled at me every time he walked by. But the kids had a really good year, and they were appreciative. I mean, I didn't do it for me, I did it for them. And I did it because we had so many options to allow them to learn. So that was something that, you know, right out of the box, I thought, wow, you know, here's me who really doesn't know that much about teaching, much less about living in the bush and not having running water and having to live in a log cabin and all those kinds of things. And then here's this other gentleman who, you know, the kids didn't get any smarter or dumber going up and down the hall. And he wasn't the worst teacher on the planet, and I certainly wasn't the best, but it was just a matter of how we looked at things and our expectations. And I told those kids, you can do this. And they believed me, and so they did. And he told them that they couldn't. And he told me, he said, I've never given anybody above a C, and I've only given a very few of those. And I was horrified. But that was the difference in maybe how old he was, maybe how long he'd been out in the bush. You know, I don't know. But it was an awakening for me, and it was a good educational um, learning point, because I don't think I would have ever thought about things like that if I hadn't been in that environment.
Mm.
So lots of those kinds of stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like it's such a important learning for you to take from that situation. And it feels like you would have also been able to apply it throughout all your,
Oh, yeah.
throughout your career, like, traveling and experiencing other cultures and things like this. Is that, certain things are very contextual, right? And
Yes.
certain
And
things
I
are,
was always conscious
mm,
of being a guest in the village, even if I, you know, even after a whole year or however long I stayed, and even if I made, you know, lots of good friends and all of that, I was a guest. I wasn't going to stay there the rest of my life, and they
mm,
knew that. And I knew that I had to behave in ways that were, you know, not special. But I guess, you know, when you grow up as a preacher's kid, you learn in lots of situations that there's different expectations of the preacher's kids. And I never liked those different expectations, and I rebelled against them with great panache, and much to my father's dismay. But I think even that, you know, way back then, when I had no clue that I was ever gonna A, teach school, or B, go to Alaska, or do any of the things that I've had the opportunity to do, it sort of set the stage.
mm,
And then as you were saying, Leslie, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
that's right.
um, as we as I was able then to move in different cultures, in as a consultant and a trainer and that sort of thing, um, again, I was always conscious of, you know, I can't tell them you must do this kind of a thing, even though some of the programs were, I had to get them to buy in to do certain things in their jobs, but I couldn't ever approach it like that because I was the guest. And I still feel that way. I mean, I have citizenship, and sometimes I still feel like a guest in Canada. So there you go.
Mm.
Once a guest, always a guest, I guess.
And I think that's it's such a nice way to put it. And I love the way that you say that, that you frame that you're a guest, wherever it is that you go. And like, I guess that sort of infers like a level of humility and openness to whatever you're walking into. And that like, it's regardless of, whether it's a different country, it's a different, part of the same country you're going to, a different industry that you're stepping into, anything like this. You come with a level of, I guess, expertise to impart on people, but it must be adapted to the way that people are receptive to it, right? Depending on where they're
Absolutely.
from, what the environment is like, all these sorts of things. So, yeah,
Yeah,
I really like the way that you frame it
I do
as being a
too.
guest. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that, I don't really know where that concept kind of came from. I mean, if it came from somebody else, I'm sure it did at some point in my life. But um, nobody ever told me that. And in some of those villages, I mean, that was the largest village I ever was in. There's like 500 people if you counted all the sled dogs, and there were lots of sled dogs. But I was in some really tiny ones, like maybe 50 people, and so there was a certain amount of this is a bad way to say it, but kind of people looked at the teachers as kind of the authority, the leaders up on the hill, because the school was always on a hill. I don't know why, but anyway, it was. And so you had to kind of balance the fact that they came to you for important things or to try to understand something. When public health officials came through to, give shots and do things like that, sometimes especially some of the older folks in some of the villages were a little leery of these young men that were passing out pills and giving shots and stuff, and they would bring the pills and they say, should we take these? and I said, well, where'd you get them? Oh, well, the doctor. Yeah. And I said, well, if the doctor gave them to you, then I'm sure it's okay. But so you had to kind of balance between being some sort of an authority figure in many instances, and also being a guest and not trying to take over the village or get them to do things that they weren't familiar with, or they didn't understand, or weren't relevant to where they were. So lots of different stories like that.
Yeah, and it sounds to me like really what you're doing was you were meeting people where they were at, and you were very conscious of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to sound like I was always 100% successful, because it wasn't. And I certainly made mistakes, but I learned a long time ago that, that's the way you grow and that's the way you learn, as long as you don't keep making the same mistake over and over. And so I was fortunate in that they taught me probably as much or more than I taught them, just in different ways. But you take things for granted. There was one young woman in one of the villages. She was like 12, and there were lots of what am I trying to say? Hygiene. That's not the right word, but anyway, it was hard. It was hard for people to keep clean. They didn't have running water and all that kind of thing. And so there was often a lot of infections, and the kids had lots of ear infections. And so they often had to go to the hospital in Anchorage to have their eardrums replaced. And so they had surgery and all of that. And then they had to stay there after the surgery for like 6 weeks, because they couldn't fly until their eardrums were, I don't know what, but anyway, connected properly, whatever. So this young lady came back, and she was 12, and they had a classroom in the hospital. It was a hospital for the indigenous folks, and it was run by public health, and they did really good work. And so when she came back, everybody wanted to know, what was your favorite thing about Anchorage, And she said, I have a question. And I said, what's that? She said, well, there was a window in our classroom. And I said, yeah. And she said, I used to stand at the window and look out. And she said, we were up on a higher floor. And so I could look down and I'd see all these cars going all different directions. And then every once in a while they'd stop and they'd get in straight lines. So she couldn't figure out about these cars.
Yeah.
And all she knew was that they went in different directions, and then they got in a straight line, and there was no reason. And I finally put it together and realized that she had no clue about traffic lights. And we didn't have streets, we didn't have traffic lights, we didn't have any of those things in the villages. So I grew up playing games like red light, green light, to drink your milk and, do all those silly things. So we started playing those games. We made a big, thing that we hung from the ceiling to make it look like a traffic light. And they had more fun with that. And it was something that I would never have thought of because I took it for granted. I mean, I just didn't think about it. And so they were able to learn some things that they otherwise might not have, just because we asked a simple question, which is something that even in what I do today with executives and leaders at various levels in their organizations is, you know, just ask the simple question. That's, you're going to get a lot more information than if you continue to beat on somebody to try to get them to say what you want them to say.
Yeah.
And so I think from all of those experiences, then to the most recent book that's coming out is that this model that I built about different levels of influence, there's three sustainable models, or I'm sorry, three temporary models, and then two that are sustainable. And in order to elevate your message from temporary to sustainable, you need to elevate your message. And to elevate your message, you need to provide the people that you're talking to with something from your own personal experience, which is about telling part of your story to help, because that's what people want to know. I mean, charts and graphs and bullet points are necessary and they're cool and all that, but people resonate with the story behind the bullet points. That's what they want to know. They want to know why. How come this happened? And so my focus in the book and the examples and all of that are about different organizations and different leaders at different levels that were able to elevate their message just by telling a simple experience that they had or that they were involved in some way. It might have been an indirect association, but something that was personal to them in some way. And it makes all the difference in the world. And I think in terms of writing that kind of a book, there's lots of books out there about using storytelling in business, and people much more educated in that and much more well known than I have written those books, and I've used them as reference and all of that. So I didn't think that there needed to be necessarily another book like that. So I realized that we use communication primarily to persuade and influence people, and if that's true, which I believe it is, then so there aren't that many books written specifically about influence in terms of communication. And so that's kind of why I chose that and why I tried to build this model around that kind of approach rather than that. But the the bottom line is that when you cross from influencing at a temporary level, you know, telling somebody what to do and they do it, well, that's great, and that's a certain kind of influence, but it's not very lasting. And when you go up a little higher and can get people to become leaders themselves and encourage them to influence others and those kinds of things, then you have to be willing to give some of your own personal identity, personal experience to connect better, because that's what they'll remember.
Yeah. And I think it's a very interesting sort of way to look at it. I mean, both Shaun and I have been, people in the corporate space as well, in managerial positions, and so I guess I can resonate with what you're saying to a certain degree. You know, in my own experience, there is a very different way of looking at people management and influencing and leadership with regards to, what is very process driven, very technical, very directive. It's very clearly mapped out, and they try and make sure that it's as intricate as possible, so that is, quote unquote foolproof. And I think that, to a certain extent, these types of approaches, they do work because, but then again, it speaks to the, the sort of difference that you're looking at in terms of directing people versus teaching people to understand and resonate with the concepts in their own way, through story, through a more empathic way of, seeing things, right? It's about empathy. It's about understanding, a very human trait in a very technical realm, this sort of thing.
And we touch each other's lives, and whether we're talking like this or whether we're just hearing about somebody else or seeing certain things or looking at body language, and there's all kinds of different clues that help us communicate better. And there's, as you said, Leslie, there's definitely a place for the more directive, the more, this is what you got to do, and you got to do it this way, and you got to do it now. I mean, there's very technical things that have to be communicated that way, or they don't work. There's people that are new at their job, and they don't know how to do some of the things that they need to learn to do. And the only way they're going to learn is for somebody to tell them and to show them and to give them some sort of feedback and expectation so that they do it. But is that a lasting piece of influence? And as that person grows in their own right as a business person, as a player in that community, some people are very, very happy to stay at certain levels. I'm just going to go in. This is my job. I don't want to think about it after I leave. I'm going to do what they tell me, and I'm going to leave, and it's fine. That's not me, and it's probably not you. And for the most part, anybody that wants to get ahead, that's not enough. And so we need to continue to work with those people and express ourselves in ways that are more personal, as well as more helpful and more memorable, in order for them to do it. We're all building a legacy, whether we mean to or not, and for us to build the kind of legacy that's going to live beyond us in whatever way, shape, or form, people have to know about us. And I told you some stories today. Maybe you'll think about them. Maybe you'll talk about them. Maybe you'll repeat them, or say, we met this goofy lady from Canada, and whatever. And that's fine. And maybe those stories will get changed a little bit. I heard a story about da-da-da, and it might get changed a little bit to fit a certain situation. Well, it's my story. Nobody can tell it like I can. But if it's memorable, somebody's going to be repeating it in a way that's going to fit their situation, their circumstance. And so it becomes a part then of your building of your legacy, because you're going to pass it on. Anything that you tell me, or anybody else, if I share it, then I've and most of our legacy building we never get to see. I always think of legacy as like planting a seed, and you may or may not be there when the tree grows up, but you planted it in some way, shape, or form. So something that you say to me, or I say to you, or we demonstrate to somebody else, if it's memorable enough and if it's universal enough, then they will integrate it into their way of communicating and their own influence, and so it travels.
Yes, definitely. And I think we all have stories like that we've heard from other people, and then we take them on as lessons, and then we relay them to people to show them what we've learned. Or they tell us a story, and we can say, oh, well, that's like this time. And there's definitely something to that, right? Stories are sticky.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're the languages of the soul, and that's why they travel for millennia through cultures, through different,
yeah,
you know.
yeah, they've been around for a long time, and there's really, in my opinion, this is the gospel according to Susan, that there in business especially, there's three kinds of stories that make have the best influence. One is the personal story. I can tell you a story from my own personal experience directly with me, whatever it was. Or I can tell you a parable, some lesson that I learned either by somebody else telling me something or me learning it on my own. And so those are the personal experience, the parable. And then the last one is like corporate legends, um, those stories that become part of the organization. And then when people are onboarded as new employees or whatever, they get told this story because it's part of the corporate culture. And in the book, I won't tell you the story because nobody buy the book if they listen to this podcast. But there is a thread that goes through the book of an organization that I worked with, that a story was told in a very innocuous kind of environment, but it grew and it caused something major to happen within that organization and how they behaved, and it became legendary. And nobody, I mean, the original story was certainly not considered that, but it they learned a lesson and they made it happen, and suddenly there was this whole internal marketing thing that came out of it with posters and logo shirts and all this stuff from this one story that this one young man told in a supervisory training session. And it made all the difference. I mean, it didn't take over the whole company, but I think the other thing that people have to remember, especially in business, is when we tell any kind of story, that if it's going to have the most influence and the most sustainable influence, that methodology of telling and sharing your personal experiences can't just happen one time. It has to be integrated into the fabric and into the operations of the organization. And that's the hard part, because people forget. Even though they tell stories every day, walking up and down the hall or talking on Zoom or wherever they are, they'll tell stories of, you wouldn't believe what they did to me today, kind of thing, or wow, guess what happened to me today, or anything in between those two. And they're all stories, but sometimes we don't tell them well. So that's the other part of what I do, is I try to help people learn to tell their stories well, so that they can be memorable and sustainable.
Yeah. And I think like part of that is also like, even when you tell the story without actually using, verbal communication is part of it, right? This concept of role modeling, and this is how you eventually are able to integrate a certain, way of operating or approach to your work that represents, the soul of the business, so to speak. Is that you live and breathe it, and you show it as the leader of the organization, so to speak. It's not so easy just to say, this is what it is and I'm just gonna dictate it to you, but you must live and breathe it, and even show it through non-verbal gestures and all these sorts of things to embody that, time and time again, until it, like you said, is woven into the fabric of the company itself and the culture.
And that's not easy. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
not easy to do anything within, especially the larger the organization, the harder it is, because you've got more people and more variables. But I've seen it done, and I've seen it done well, and so I know it's alive and well in certain places, and I think that they prove on a regular basis that it works, and that you can influence people to want to influence others, to want to be better leaders, and to improve along with the camaraderie and the customer experience and all those kinds of things.
Absolutely. And I guess it would be a sort of great place for you, and I'd love to give you the space to, share, I guess, a little bit about, what you're sort of working on right now, and even, share a bit more about the book that is coming out. I think whenever this episode goes live, it might already be available. So, yeah.
Well, it will be available on all the different Amazon platforms or websites, I guess. So it'll be available in Australia, at Amazon.au or co.au or whatever, however you do it. I get confused. There's too many of them. And that's going to be the primary distribution point, so that people around the world can actually have access to it. It will be in softcover as well as in Kindle version. And we will be having an online virtual launch party on the 17th of November. So there will be announcements of that going out next week in terms of the connection for online and that sort of thing. So I think it'll be fun. There'll be several. The gentleman that's going to MC it is from the UK. And then we've got somebody from Berlin that's going to be saying a few words, and a few of the people that endorsed the book that are going to just say a few things about what they took away from it, or what they thought was the most important part, or those kinds of things. I'm not really concerned about them saying how great it is, or how wonderful I wrote it, or any of that stuff. I'm just excited that they've endorsed it to start with, and that they've been agreeable to do it. It's not going to be a big deal. I mean, it'll last probably somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour, depending on how long-winded some of those people are. But so that's really kind of consuming my days at this point, because if I'm not doing something on it to get ready for it on my own, the publisher is on the phone or badgering me by email to do this or do that. And I said, I wrote the book. You guys are supposed to take care of all this. No, you have to do this. So that's part of, the whole thing. But it's fun, and they're a great group of people, and they're, again, located in various places. It's a Canadian-based publisher, but they've got people in Portugal and Asia, Thailand, and around. So again, I'm I'm hooked up with some of those global folks, and that makes me feel good, because that's kind of who I've become, whether by design or by accident, we're not sure, but it's that. And then the only other things I have coming up between now and the end of the year will be I'm speaking at a couple of different virtual events. One in November, shortly after the book launch, and which is about storytelling. It's called the Real, I could never say it, the Real International Film Festival. So it's all about stories in film. So Real is REAL, and then REEL, and then Film Festival. So it's a 3-day event, I think, and there'll be panels and various things about storytelling and the importance of it. And then I'll be speaking. I think I'm the closing speaker, but I don't really remember for sure. And then there's another one in December, in mid-December, about how to fast track your business for 2021 or something like that. And so they've asked me to do a keynote about the book. That's
Wonderful. Wonderful. There's a lot there. And
what I'm up to.
what I'll do is I'll grab all the links from you, and then I'll put them onto our show notes so our audience can, check in.
I'll send them to you on the You mean for the party? Is that what you mean?
Oh, for everything. We'll share everything with the
Oh, okay.
audience so that they're
Okay.
able to get in touch with
Excellent.
you. Yeah, absolutely. So that,
Awesome.
yeah. So thanks for that. Yeah, Shauno, where can people find you, mate?
Yeah, easiest place to find me is on Instagram. So just Shaun_Coop, SHAUN_COOP. And you, Les?
Yeah, so you can find me on my website, findingspace.co. You can always get in touch with me there. You know, if there's anything you need from me, any services that you want to get in touch with, be sure to send me an email. You can sign up to my newsletter if you want to keep abreast of anything that I'm doing. I think by the time this episode airs, I will have my meditation program out. So, you know, keep your eyes out for that.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and in Facebook and Instagram, you can find me at findingspace.co as well. Just for the audience, if you want to get in touch with Shaun and I for this podcast, if you want to get in touch with Susan, anything about this episode or want to come on as a guest, it's the Hustle and Flow podcast at gmail.com.
Cool. And yeah, I just want to thank you, Susan, for coming on today and
Thank
sharing some of
you.
your story with us.
My pleasure.
We got to the start part, and there's so much more that you just told us in the brief introduction about
You said
life
keep
stories.
it brief. I couldn't write all that.
Yeah.
You'd be reading yet.
Yeah. But you know, it was very interesting your time you know, teaching people in Indigenous Alaska, and then where your life has taken you, and really where you've taken your own life, right? You mentioned you'd never been satisfied and that you didn't want to stay doing the same thing, and you definitely didn't. It really progressed, and it's taught you so much, and now you're using that knowledge to teach others, and I think it's really commendable. And so thank you for sharing some of that with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It was my pleasure, and it was fun. You guys made it easy, even with all the glitches and whatever. But I do have a media page on my website, so if you can send me the link or whatever for when this,
Absolutely.
then
For
I'll
sure.
put it on there as well.
Yeah,
We should do
absolutely.
that. And as always, guys, a humble request: if you took something from this conversation, a nugget, something that resonated with you, and you think it might help someone else to hear this conversation, please just share it with one other person. That's how we grow the podcast. And we hope that you enjoyed today. And until next time, guys.
See you guys.